Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us for the sixth webinar in Hope Community Capital's 2026 Educational Webinar Series. We are delighted to have you here for today's conversation. My name is Carrie Sanders, and I am the CEO and founder of Hope Community Capital, and I'll be supporting today's session. Just a couple notes before we dive in. We encourage you to share questions throughout the webinar using the Q&A feature. We'll reserve time at the end of the webinar for discussion. And today's webinar is being recorded, so all registered participants will receive a recording after today's event and will also be posted to the resources section of our website for future reference. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce today's speakers who will be joining the webinar here after I introduce them. First, we have Sierra Johnson. Sierra Johnson is the Vice President of NMTC Advisory here at Hope Community Capital, and she leads the firm's national work in new markets tax credits, Qualic B and project sponsor consulting, community development entity, advisory services, and complex community finance strategy. She brings over 15 years of experience across academic, nonprofit, and government sectors to today's conversation. Sarah Cunningham and Marilyn Thomas will be coming to us from CEI Capital Management LLC, or CCML, a Maine-based community development entity whose primary business is NMTC lending with a focus on rural manufacturing and good job creation and preservation, which we are strong supporters of here at Hope Community Capital. CCML has deployed over $1.2 billion in allocation authority into 110 projects since the inception of the NMTC program in 2000. Let me repeat those numbers. 1.2 billion plus, because I think there were a couple closings last week, and 110 projects since the inception of the program in 2000. That's incredible. Sarah Cunningham is CCML's compliance officer, and she's responsible for the design, development, and management of both the federal and state NMTC regulatory and program compliance. Her oversight and management during underwriting, closing, and throughout the life of the compliance period is a key element to CCML's success. She has over 20 years of experience in the compliance industry with strategic involvement in the deployment of over $250 million in new market tax credits, lending a wealth of information to today's webinar. Marilyn is the Senior Asset and Relationship Manager at CCML, where she oversees all asset management issues during the underwriting, closing, compliance period, and exit stage. In addition, she negotiates and implements required changes to the asset structure during the life cycle of each transaction. And just a side note, we've been working with Marilyn and her team for quite a few years here at Hope Community Capital. And one thing we find ourselves asking ourselves when things get tricky in the new markets compliance world is, what would Marilyn do? With more than 35 years of combined asset and risk management experience and the oversight of more than $1 billion in assets, Marilyn offers a wealth of knowledge in this realm. And finally, we have Marshall Spivey, who is the CFO at Premium Peanut. Premium Peanut handles roughly 10% of all peanuts grown in the United States, with an annual operating capacity of over 420,000 tons, and what they believe to be one of the most efficient shelling facilities in the world. Premium Peanut has paid dividends since 2018, returning over $120 million in dividends to its grower owners to date. Earlier this year, Premium Peanut opened North America's newest and most innovative peanut shelling plant in Santee, South Carolina, which was their third NMTC transaction. They have closed over $75 million in NMTC transactions over 3 facilities since 2016. Marshall is joining us today as an expert in project sponsor compliance, providing you insight and tips and tricks into a successful client journey through and closing an NMTC transaction. Thank you all for joining us. Sierra and team, please come in.
Hi, everybody.
Good Hi. Afternoon. Okay, I'm going to get us started here. How's that look?
Looks great.
Looks great. All right, so NMTC post-close. After everything it takes to close a new markets transaction, which is in and of itself a very major accomplishment for most organizations. It's important to remember that it is just the start of a 7-year partnership. Most of the work shifts from structuring and getting all of your diligence information ready to go and, delivering that to attorneys and accountants and consultants, and much to a more kind of reporting type structure. So for construction projects, the immediate focus is usually draws, inspections, budget management, working with your construction manager or GC, and that project completion. And then at the same time, you're building the rhythm of, making those payments, doing reporting, renewing your insurance, and tracking those impacts. And so, what we're really going to focus on today is making sure that you and your organization are really clear on the responsibilities that your organization has as a result of your new markets transaction. And, hopefully some tricks around creating some reliable systems and paving the way for some open communication, ultimately to make things manageable. Here we go. Okay, so for simplicity, we are going to call your organization the Qualic Bee. We are going to try and avoid using as much alphabet soup as possible. Maybe you've recently completed a transaction. Maybe you're just starting on new markets. Maybe you're in the process of closing. Qualic Bee, as you may know, stands for Qualified Active Low Income Community Business. And it's often a special purpose entity or some sort of supporting organization that may or may not have staff or office of its own. And it's truly supporting the broader organization who's actually managing the responsibilities. And so that organization, the sponsor organization, oversees construction, operations, payments, reporting, and internal coordination. And then there's a myriad of partners. So CDE, that's the lender, CDE lender, community development entity. They're going to be providing oversight of those loan documents, compliance, and tracking of good community benefits. If you're a unicorn project and you have the easiest transaction ever, you may only have, an investor and CDE as your external partners, but much more likely you're going to have title companies, senior lenders, subordinate lenders, attorneys, other transaction partners, and they're all going to have their own requirements, deadlines, reporting expectations that you need to manage and track. And so, it's important that at least one person at your organization, maybe more than one, should really understand the full picture of this transaction and the reporting requirements, so that they can kind of be the air traffic controller of the spreadsheets.
Oh, I like that reference, Sierra. The air traffic controller. That's a good one.
I heard it recently. All right, Marilyn, the floor is yours.
Perfect. Yeah, I think what I would say is for best practices, any person who's going to be involved in the day-to-day operations of the business really should be familiar with the loan agreement and their specific provisions in the loan agreement. They generally have to do with what are your obligations to the CDE lender? Generally, if we're in a deal with other CDEs, so there might be 3 other CDEs in with us, we all try to align our reporting obligations as best we can. But I would say pay really good attention to that loan agreement, because it's going to become what I would say, for lack of a better word, like your Bible for going forward for the next 7 years. It's going to tell you what are your reporting obligations, what are your payment obligations, in addition to what's in the promissory notes. And it's going to direct you to other loan documents, such as the disbursing agreement. Almost all of the projects we finance have disbursement processes. So funds are put in a dispersing agreement. Disbursement funds. There's an administrative agent. We're also, the CDE is also an agent and has responsibility for saying, yes, the funds can go out the door, the funds cannot. So be familiar with those documents as much as you can, and take advantage of CDEs when they offer to help you. So Sarah will tell you that, and I think Marshall will probably tell you, we try to be your partner in this transaction, but respecting the boundary that you're the borrower and we're your lender. But if you have questions about what your obligations are to us, we're always happy to set up phone calls with people and help you understand what you've signed on for the 7 years. So I think that one thing I would say as a best practice is, and Sierra alluded to it, is you need someone in your organization who is going to own reporting, who is going to not only make sure the reporting is done, but the reporting is delivered to the lender. And if that person, for any reason, can't meet that obligation, if they're overloaded, if they're out sick, there should be somebody to back that person up. Redundancy, I would say most organizations, especially if they're small, aren't really good about having redundancy. And if you don't have that, it's very easy to trigger a default under your loan agreement. Marshall, when you did your loans with us, what do you think was the best thing you could advise a borrower to do?
Well, several things. I think being, as everything in business, I'm a big believer in being organized and having, tasks noted and Outlook and that kind of thing, or some form of reminders for you and your team. I've had my team engaged on some of these reporting tasks so that there was not just me completing them. So I've had Laura Thomas in the last several years completing all of our year-end stuff. So I think to the point of a backup, having other people involved that know and understand the terms and the loan and the reporting requirements and that kind of thing is very valuable. And then I think for us, I mean, you all have been very helpful. I mean, Sarah sends me email reminders of things that are due. So even if I miss my quarterly or semi-annual or something like that, I've got stuck in Outlook. Sarah usually sends me an email, so I know that it's what's due and when. And then I think just going into it and making sure that you understand the responsibilities. One thing that makes it a whole lot easier is if you know what all those responsibilities are beforehand. So if you wait till you get to the end of the year and then you say, okay, for my annual reporting, these are all the things that I have to collect, then that can be a very difficult task. But if you know going into it before it starts that these are the kind of things that my team needs to be looking for and collecting and putting in a folder out on our shared drive as we go throughout the year, then it becomes a much easier task at year end. So those are some of the things that we've done here that I think have allowed us to report timely and accurate information.
Yeah, and I think that's very valid. We had a borrower years ago who had assigned responsibility to one person in his organization to understand the loan documents, be the person who compiles financial reports, submits everything to us. He did not know. He should have known what the loan document said, but he did not. And unfortunately, about 6 months into the deal, she got quite ill and she passed away. And the business owner had absolutely no idea how to provide reporting to us how to prepare the financial reports. He was good at operating the business itself, but he had never done a lot of the other functions, and he was not adequately staffed. So I can't, I think what Marshall said, having someone responsible for it, putting it in SharePoint, keeping it all together is just critical to being successful.
Marshall set us up very nicely to kind of our next session here, which is putting together a dependable system. So you don't have to become a new markets expert if you haven't already become a new markets expert throughout your closing transaction. But you do want to make sure that you are able to capture all important requirements so that you don't need to reopen hundreds of pages of closing documents every time something is due at the end of the year. And so, I think our recommendation is really, building a compliance calendar, and making sure that you're tracking the dates that matter. And, each of these documents, if you're working with a consultant or an attorney, they can help highlight which documents, you really need to be paying attention to. Marilyn mentioned your loan agreement, which is, really you're going to be your operating manual, but there might be, other loan obligations. You may have a separate community benefit agreement. You may have a separate dispersing agreement. And they all have specific milestones that you're needing to achieve, or you will be achieving, but that you need to report on. Oftentimes if you're doing a construction project, there might be specific things that you need to deliver once you finish construction. And so tracking both the due date and when you should begin preparing each of those items can be really helpful. And, putting that in your Outlook calendar or your physical calendar or, whatever it is, your iPhone calendar that's going to alert you at, midnight and a very inconvenient time, but at least it's got your attention. That can be really helpful. And then, I think identifying who that primary owner is, and who will be backing them up. And most importantly, if you do have a backup, and it's your calendar that's tracking things, how will they be notified, or where can they go to find the supporting information that's required to be submitted? Sarah?
Make responsibility clear. You're going to hear some redundancy here, but after closing, one of the most important things a Qualic B or a borrower can do is establish very clear internal ownership over all of the post-closing obligations. What do we mean by that? Sierra's talked about it a little bit. Marilyn's talked about it a little bit. Marshall's talked about it a little bit. Create that tracking spreadsheet or that checklist. It's going to be the most important thing that you do. Using a mechanism for tracking all of these reoccurring requirements is going to make it easier on everybody. And when you're building your trackers, think of the 5 W's. We all know and remember the 5 W's, right? Who, what, where, why, when, and how. We're going back to what, third grade English here. The who, in this case, who's responsible for the item. Be sure to assign a point person and a backup. This is redundant, but it's important. The what. What's the name of the report or the item that needs to be submitted? For example, your financial audits, your quarterly financials, your compliance certificates, which is one of my favorites, your payment due dates. There's going to be many, many, many due dates, so staying organized is really key. The where does the item and the backup information live? Is it kept in a shared file or in an internal drive? I think Marshall may have spoken to this a little bit. Documenting the location in your tracker is also very important because then it's easy for everybody to access and know where it is. The why. Why do I have to submit this item? Why do I have to take this action? Listing out which agreement or loan doc the reporting item can be found in is really helpful. And I'm sure Marshall can tell you more. I'm sure he does the same thing. Be sure to jot down the section number in the operative document so it's easy to refer back to. Loan documents can be very, very long. For example, your loan agreement will outline most of your reporting items. But also, like Sierra said and Marilyn said, be sure that you also check your guarantee docs, your community benefits agreement, your promissory notes, and your dispersing agreements. They may all have additional reporting requirements that aren't found in the loan agreement. And the when. When is the item due? And not only when it's due, but also when should you get started on it? Some of the reporting items require more lead time than others, so documented a get started date is pretty helpful. And then finally, the how. How should the item be submitted and to whom? Is there a shared drive that you upload it to? Do you need to send it on email? Who needs to be copied on the email? Do you have more than one new markets lender that needs to be copied? So be sure to document all of these details. It's going to make your life a lot easier when it comes time to submit these items. And now, Marshall, you've been through a couple of new markets compliance periods. How did you all approach keeping track of reporting items and payments?
Well, I'm a checklist person, right? So my team and I, we've got a checklist like for month end and quarter end of things that we do. To me, the hardest ones to remember and keep up with are the ones that are due semi-annually or annually, because I lose track of those. They're not on my brain. It's like, okay, this is coming up. The monthly and quarterly stuff are easy because I get into a routine and a norm of doing those. But for me, I'm a checklist person, so we've got a closing checklist, right, of things and monthly, quarterly. So that's how we do it here. And obviously we have had two different deals going on at the same time, in addition to other reporting requirements to our primary lenders and other things. So that to us, that's been very important.
A lot to keep track of.
Yeah, and I'll add, if you have existing lending relationships, or maybe you're a nonprofit and you have existing grant reporting requirements, it's okay to ask as these documents are being drafted, like, hey, I already have, a quarterly reporting schedule that I'm adhering to, and I set aside, at the beginning of every March to submit these reporting requirements. Can we align our reporting requirements in my loan agreement or my community benefits agreement to match up with, the systems that are already in place, rather than, piling on top, or maybe this is your second transaction and it's like, why am I going to do this in February and March if I can do it all in March? And I would say overall, most of your transaction partners are willing and excited to be flexible with you, so that, they have a better chance of getting their documents as well.
Sierra,
Such a good
that's a
point.
really good point. If you don't mind me adding one thing, our year end is really weird. It's kind of an odd time, but I think in all of our deals, the lenders have helped us by setting up things where it followed my normal quarterly reporting. So that's a really important one to bring up if you're like us and you don't have the 12/31 year end that a lot of people expect.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that just goes back to what Marilyn said. We really, new markets lenders, we want to be your partner. We don't want to make your life any harder than it has to be. So we're always looking to find ways to ease the burden on you, for sure.
And it certainly makes things easier when a project says up front, hey, by the way, my year end isn't 12/31, it's the first Saturday of every February or something. We do have projects that have funny year ends, and it's a whole lot easier to know up front and bake it into the documents and make changes to the document, the timing of reporting accordingly, than to find out, oh, we expect your March 31st financial statements and you don't create one. And
Yeah.
now we have to go back and reopen documents. And we don't want to do that. We don't want our borrowers to have to expend more money fixing errors from the beginning. So it's really critical that communication is good on the front end.
Yep, absolutely. And so this next slide here, making reporting routine. I just jotted down a few tips that I might share as you all are thinking about putting your trackers together. The first is setting reminders before the deadlines are due. I know we've already said this, but it's really important to build in those reminders before the deadline rather than relying on the deadline itself. The second one is working backwards from the due date. For example, if you've got something that's due on March 31st, that might require information or input from the finance department and the HR department, and that can take some time to come together. So making sure to put the internal collection dates on the calendar and working your way backward from the actual due date is going to help you in the long run. Don't assume that requirements all go to the same party. I think we've already talked about this. Different new markets lenders may have different reporting requirements. So understanding what goes to whom and when is really key. The governing document should be your source for determining your obligations. When I put together a tracking spreadsheet, I like to cite the document, but also pull an excerpt with the specific language from the document. It just helps the borrower know exactly what needs to be submitted in a particular package. For example, when you submit your quarterly financials, sometimes a no default certificate is also due. And having the language, say from the loan agreement, that says everything that needs to be submitted as part of those quarterly financials is going to be really helpful when it comes time to submit. That way you make sure nothing's missed. The next important one is collecting impact data as services are delivered. And I think Marshall was alluding to this. If you keep up with it throughout the year, it will just make your annual impact reporting much smoother. And you can thank Marshall and I for this tip a little bit later. You'll be thinking about it, I'm sure. And here's one that we didn't really talk about for the slides, but keeping evidence of submission and final copies of what was provided is really important. I don't know if you can hear in the background, but my inbox notifications are going ping, 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 ping. New markets lenders they're busy folks, and we have very busy inboxes. I, for example, am responsible for monitoring and collecting all of the required reporting for our new markets portfolio. And sometimes I miss an email submission or two. It happens. So it's always so helpful when a borrower can re-forward an email or provide proof that they've already submitted a document to make sure that our records are accurate. And I can see Marshall nodding his head over there. There may be a time or two where I was looking for something he already submitted. And then assigning both a primary owner and a backup. As you all know, staff turnover in a 7-year compliance period, I wouldn't say it's common, but it's likely. And I bring you back to Marilyn's example where the point person, I was going to say she abruptly left, but unfortunately, yes, she passed away. And after her passing, no one understood the requirements or really what any of it meant. And it was really starting from scratch. And so that was really a challenge, both for the new markets lenders, for us, and for the borrower. And all of that burden could have been seamlessly taken care of if they just would have assigned a backup person. So that point is really, really important. So maybe I'll ask Marshall, like your organization is a shining star in our new markets portfolio, both when it comes to timely reporting and to payments. Do you have any tips or tricks that maybe, I know you've mentioned a couple already, but do you have any others that you wanted to share about making reporting routine?
Yeah, I think, like I said, just getting on the norm, knowing what's monthly, what's quarterly, knowing ahead of time, being set up and prepared to have those items. It's a lot easier to do things if you have them on your mind and you got them on your list and you're doing them, like I said, annual stuff, you're collecting it throughout the year. I mean, those are the biggest tips I can give you. And then, like I said, I had my team engaged where it's not one person. I've got other people that are working on things as well. So those are the best tips I can give.
That's great. Thank you.
Sarah, I just thought of one more thing as well. Where some of our deals have education and support funds that support employee training. I think that some borrowers do the training, but they're not necessarily tracking that training and the expenses commensurate with it. And that's a really important thing to remember. It's built into the community benefit agreement, and the money is set aside for it. So it's in the borrower's best interest to use those proceeds, which they're paying back anyway, for the intended purposes and to appropriately track so they can get reimbursed for those costs.
For sure.
Here we go. Yes. So
Managing
managing
changes.
changes. Yes. So I'm sure if we all think back to the last 7 years, we've had some changes, and I think we can anticipate some changes 7 years from now.
We certainly can.
Yes, we
I
can.
think it's important to note that change isn't always a bad thing during the compliance period, but sometimes it is. So it's important to really communicate with your CDE lenders. Call before you make a change. I think maybe I can flip this to Marilyn to talk about a few of the changes that you may want to consult with your CDE lenders before you really jump into anything.
Yeah, and I think when you're operating a business, change is inevitable. Businesses go through a life cycle, just like people do. They start as sort of infants and toddlers. They grow into teens who can sometimes be a little obstinate, and then finally settle into adulthood, and then fall back into the toddler stage sometimes. And I think the important part of this is that we expect change to occur at the business level. And what we also expect is that people will come to us and say, we thought this project would be completed in 12 months, but it's now taking 18 months. Or it's going to take 24 months and we misjudged the cost because of this extended period of time. And so our budget has increased. And instead of running out and borrowing new money without communicating that to your CDE lender, you're best to send an email and say, here's what our problem is, here's what caused it. We need to borrow more money, or we need to raise equity in order to support this budget shortfall. How can we do it without causing compliance problems? And when I say compliance problems, I'm talking about this terrible term called significant modifications. And significant modifications could be you obtain additional debt without consent that cause the repayment of the existing debt to become in question, or to become so deeply subordinate to other debt that the chance of repayment is diminished to the point where it may be deemed equity. You don't want to jeopardize the tax credits. The borrower has signed an indemnity agreement agreeing that if the investor loses the tax credits because of something the borrower has done, we don't want you to be in that position. What we want you to do is communicate with your lender and talk up front about all of the different things that can happen. Like with disbursements, we want the same thing that you want. We want you to get your money quickly because we want to avoid a stoppage of work, which can happen. We want to avoid having liens filed against the project because there's a delay in funding. Nobody wants to deal with liens on a project, especially any other lenders who are involved. So knowing that you all want the same thing, if borrowers can provide all of the backup support for what they're asking for. So if you're looking for a payment on a piece of equipment and you want to be reimbursed for that, and it's a progress payment. Progress payments are they're very common. You're buying a large piece of equipment, you're going to put 33% down, you're going to pay another 33 as it's being shipped, or another the balance when it gets to your facility, whatever that is. Don't assume we remember that 3 months ago you submitted the first invoice to us, and now you're looking for another chunk of money. If you can just make a notation on the invoice that says, this is progress payment number 2, and here's the original invoice. If the more orderly those disbursement requests can be, the quicker we get through it, the quicker the dispersing agent can go through it, and we can tie up invoices to actual payments. And again, it goes to having a system where you're keeping track of all of your invoices, and collecting lien waivers when you're paying subs and things like that. And sometimes your budget changes.
Yep.
And all of those things can happen.
I would add, and I would like to hear kind of Marshall if he's learned anything from construction projects, but before you close, always making sure that you go through your dispersing agreement with your GC and make sure that they understand what's being asked of them to provide, because often it's slightly more, not, significantly more, but maybe your lender is asking for notarized lien waivers from subcontractors, or whatever it may be, something that they wouldn't necessarily be providing if your organization is just directly paying the contractor. And so making sure that they understand what's being asked of them can always, the first draw is always a little bumpy, but having draws 2 through 12 be very straightforward, can be really, really helpful.
I'll add, I don't think for our last two projects that it was overly burdensome. I think we set up things, in both of those projects, we had a primary general contractor who was dealing with the subs, and then we had a primary equipment provider that we were buying a large amount of equipment from for those projects. So in those cases, we made sure with both of those that we knew what we needed to be able to provide reporting wise and around lien waivers and that kind of thing. And so that we knew that we were getting monthly what we needed in advance. And so then the general contractor and the equipment provider, we were able to pretty easily provide the information that was needed, and it went pretty smoothly. And then from a budget standpoint, those last two projects, I think this was our second deal, our second plan. I think everything was on budget and went pretty well. This last project, we ended up being over budget some and had to communicate some things around that. So I think it just depends on the project, and obviously knowing what's going to be required is very important.
I don't know who typed that, but I like that. Early communication. Well, and I think that I've been a lender. Prior to this, I was a lender for a long time, and I worked at national banks and worked on real estate portfolios and C&I portfolios. And the one thing I would say, to all borrowers is communication. When borrowers don't communicate about, hey, we're thinking about selling the organization, it's problematic, because it's costly. As a lender, we have to figure out, well, what does that mean? Is it simply a stock sale? Is it a sale where the purchaser is just selling the stock in the business and nothing else is changing? Is it an asset sale, in which case we need new tax opinions and projections? How exactly is the sale going to be structured? All of those things, if you're dealing with a bank, are expensive if you're changing ownership. But when you're dealing in a new markets loan, it becomes much more complicated. So I guess my general advice to people is, if they're thinking of doing a new markets loan, but in the back of their head, they're thinking, I'd like to sell this business in 3 years and get out, then, you hate to say it, but I'm not always sure that a new markets loan is the best vehicle. I think it's great to talk to your consultant about that and make sure they're aware of what you're thinking, because we want to be mindful of how you spend your money. You only have so much for resources, and we want to be mindful of that. the other thing you want to make sure is that you don't change the location of the business. And we say this, when I say it, you're all shaking your head saying, well, yeah, of course you don't. Well, it's been done, and that also creates compliance problems.
Yeah.
We have been fortunate to have a business that changed location that thankfully was in a new market qualified census tract. It doesn't mean it didn't create problems because they'd already signed a lease to operate there without telling us. So it's a lot of legal fees while the lenders are trying to figure out, is this going to be problematic for the structure? So, Sierra, what's your thought on that?
I agree. There's a lot of wonderful benefits to this program. Marshall has done 3 of them, so obviously it's worked really well for Preenie and Peanut. But if you, yeah, just like you said, if you're imagining that you're going to significantly change, the structure or the location or the character of your business in 3 to 4 years, it's it's very rigid in the way that it's structured, and it's a federally kind of sponsored program, for lack of a better term, and you know, it's like turning a cruise ship. It's not a nimble program by any means. And so, um, it might not be the best fit for an organization if they're planning on making some significant changes in 7 years. Again, knowing that lots of unforeseen changes may come down the pike, and that's to be expected. But
Yes. Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, we all, in our personal lives, I'm sure we all have had things that you never anticipated happening that interrupted
mhm.
your work. But when you're in the back of your head are thinking, I'd like to retire in 4 years, and shut this place down, then it's one thing to say I want to retire in 4 years, but I have somebody who's going to take my place. And that's a great plan. So organizational changes can be good, they can be necessary, they can bring fresh blood to a company that might be sort of floundering under an owner who's just lost interest. But it's definitely a conversation with your lender.
Yeah. And I think it's also, whether you're, large company, small company, for-profit, nonprofit, bringing the full leadership in. So, if you're a nonprofit, making sure that your board of directors really understands, what they're signing up for. Or, if you have a board for your, company, making sure that they, really understand what they're signing up for. I think we've got about 15 minutes, so we'll keep this moving along. But yeah, let's briefly talk about the compliance certificate here, Sarah.
Yes, this is one we can go over really quickly,
Yeah.
but it's a good one, and it's a very important one. The annual, sometimes semi-annual, sometimes annual quality compliance certificate. It's some borrowers treat it as just an annual administrative task that just needs to be signed off on and submitted. That is the absolute wrong way to approach this. You need to think of this more as an annual compliance review of your project, really. Before certifying anything, compare the questions that you're attesting to or the statements that you're attesting to against what's actually happened during the prior year. The point person should really know and understand the document and be thinking about business decisions throughout the year that may impact the following year's certificate. And I'll just mention a couple quick questions that you should be thinking about as you're going through the document. Here's some things you're going to want to be asking yourself. Is the project still operating as contemplated at closing? Have there been changes in the ownership or organizational structure? Has the organization incurred additional debt or changed its financing? Have there been any significant changes in the business plan or the use of the facility? And are the QLICI proceeds and finance asset still being used as contemplated? And you also, again, might need to reach out to different departments to get sign off on all these items. So really the key takeaway for me is the compliance certificate is really an opportunity to identify and address issues, not just simply sign it off that nothing has changed. So I think that we can conclude that slide with that quick overview, unless anybody else has anything to add.
I mean, I will say that, I don't know if you would agree with this, Marshall, but, being in a new markets compliance period, the kind of happy accident is that are taking on those kind of good business practices that we all know we should be doing, but maybe we're not doing because, the day-to-day operations of running your business, take precedent. And so, it can be a little bit of a happy accident to be reviewing your financials and, so on and so forth.
We've been pretty fortunate from this area because we haven't really changed our business model from any of these deals and what we were doing or how we were doing it or what business we were in or moved anything or changed, we've been in the same, that business has been successful and then been in the same business as was contemplated in when we closed the deal. So we've been pretty fortunate with our projects in that regard.
You make good peanuts. I've had them. Keeping the end in mind. So plan early for year 7.
All right. So year 7, I would say start planning year 7 and year 6. So at CCML, we typically start to get the invoice or a draft invoice for the unwind prepared in year 6, a 1 year out invoice where we're sending it to the borrower and saying, here's what your payment obligations are going to be when we unwind. Oftentimes, these are promissory notes that you're signing. They all have different terms of repayment. If there's hard money on that funded the leverage loan and that matures at the same time as the leverage debt, then the promissory note may have hard money due at the time of unwind. And we want our projects to be as prepared as possible for what's going to occur at year 7. So I would encourage all borrowers, start talking to your lender in year 6 about what happens at unwind. What does this look like? What kind of people should I get involved? Who should I talk to? And in most cases, for a nonprofit business, there may be debt forgiveness because if you're a nonprofit, it might not be a taxable event for you. But if you're a for-profit entity, there could be tax implications as a result of the unwind. So get your accountant up to speed, get your attorney involved, and be aware what your obligations are to the lenders, and reach out, and ask, what should we be looking at? What should we do? And Sarah will tell you we're more than happy to talk to our projects really early and just give them a heads up. And I know Marshall's been through one unwind with us, and I think we probably started that one about 9 months out, where we started talking about what's going to happen and what needs to be done.
Yeah, that can, it can save legal bills. You're not having to sort through the documents with your lawyers. I was recently working through an unwind memo for a client that's unwinding in December and found that their, source loan for their leverage loan was maturing before their QLICs. And so there may be some documentation that happened 7 years ago that was perhaps inappropriate for the transaction. And so, getting ahead of that so that you don't accidentally default on loans.
Yeah.
One thing that I had a client tell me recently that I think is just a wonderful idea, and this kind of goes back to, keeping everybody in the loop, is as you get started on a transaction, maybe 3 to 4 months before you actually start closing, set up like an NMTC at hopecommunitycapital.com so that all of the emails associated with the transaction go through that email, all of the reporting goes through that email. And so that if there is a change or, you're wanting to go look back, and I don't know about you all, but digging through my email for some document that I sent 5 years ago, not always the easiest process. That can help narrow down the communication and perhaps documentation that needs to come up. Marshall, any other kind of nuggets of wisdom you want to pass along before we probably have time for 1 or 2 questions?
Yeah, and, internal ownership, I think I've definitely covered organized records. I think that we talked about that. Timely communication, Marilyn and her team and the other CDs we've worked with have all been great partners for us. We've had some things we've had to communicate in the past that, okay, we're going to need to do another, change in our credit agreement with our primary lender, and we've had to change our intercreditor or get with our attorneys, their attorneys. So there's a couple times we've had to do something. I think timely communication and explaining the business purpose for those type of situations is important. On the early exit planning, that's one where the exit planning, I think Marilyn covered it well. You need to get started early. You need to understand what it looks like well in advance, and you need to understand if there's going to be a tax event for you in your company. So I think those are the key pieces, and I think for us, our first deal and our second deal were different. So you've got to understand the complexities and especially the exit planning for your deal and how that's going to look for your company.
Thanks. Carrie, were there any questions that came in that, maybe we didn't cover?
Yes, I have one, just a lightning round question. What is the most common post-close mistake that each of you has encountered? Maybe Marshall, you only encountered it once since you've closed 3 transactions by now, but if you could each just comment on what you view as kind of the most common post-close mistake.
I would say taking the closing binder, putting it on the shelf, and not looking at it again until someone tells you a report's due. That's probably your number one mistake from my perspective.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Sarah. Anybody else want to join in? Most common post-close mistake.
Mine is oh, go ahead, Marilyn.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
This is unique if you're taking on a transaction for the second time, but maybe you have some experience with debt in your organization before. It's assuming that one transaction in the reporting is going to look the same as another transaction in reporting. CCML is a completely different organization than, name another CDE. Sometimes they are on a transaction together, but sometimes they're separate and they all have different business strategies and internal procedures and number of folks that are working there. And Sarah may be sending you an email every quarter, but Sally might not. So, assuming that it's going to look the same, across transactions, I think that's a mistake. We all like to make things easy.
That's such a good point, Sierra, because I think most CDEs do try to work collaboratively to reduce the burden on borrowers, but there's some instances where we just can't. For instance, if, CDEs have different fiscal year ends and have to do our reporting a little bit different, inevitably there's going to be some reporting that's going to be different across the different parties. So that's a really good point.
Marilyn, did you have something?
Yeah, I was going to say not understanding who the post-closing contacts are. Like you close the deal, the attorneys have been involved, the investment officers involved, and the borrowers involved. And like Sarah said, they put it on the shelf, but who do you deal with after the closing when, you're getting emails from people you've never heard of? And so I think understanding who are those post-closing contacts for the borrower, for us to understand who should they be at the CDE, the investor, things like that.
Good
And
one.
Marshall, I don't know if you wanted to add anything.
I don't know. I thought I had one in mind, but somebody already got it. So.
Okay. Well, I think this will wrap up then our question and answer portion, but I will, because I have to have a word here. So just a couple things I would add to this conversation. One is, you as a Qualic B, as a project sponsor, do not wait for the CDE to call you or the lender to call you to tell you what's due. You literally signed documents saying that you would be responsible for your reporting. So they're not going to call you. Don't wait for it. They won't. If they're excellent, like CCML, sometimes they might. But generally speaking, that is on the project to do. The other thing I would just highly recommend, and it's something that Hope Community Capital insists on doing as part of what Marilyn shared there, which is that you as a Qualic B should insist that your consultant provide a transition memo that talks about what is happening after closing. And within that should be all of the contact information, which of course changes over 7 years inevitably, but insist that your consultant provide a transition memo if you are a project. So that will wrap us up for today. Thank you so much, Sierra, Sarah, Marilyn, and Marshall, for sharing your expertise and providing awesome information to all of our participants. And thank you to all who have joined us. We hope this webinar provided useful strategies and lessons learned. And as a reminder, you're going to find this recording and other educational resources on our resources webpage at hopecommunitycapital.com. And our 7th webinar in our 2026 series is Beyond Four Walls, Investing in Dignity, Stability, and Opportunity, is coming up in late September. I will be leading an open discussion on that one about how developers and funders should think about supportive services in housing. We'll move to housing on that one. How they should think about supportive services not as something that quote unquote gets added to housing development to get points for funders, etc., but rather is part of a broader ecosystem that helps people flourish. And that is what we are all about here at Hope Community Capital. Further details can be found on our events webpage. Please stay up to date with upcoming events, news, and insights by joining our mailing list. And we want to say thank you and have a great day.
Thanks for having us, Carrie.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Carrie.